Against the motion. I'd like to tell you that you guys would be getting involved with this as well, because we're going to get you to vote on the motion yourselves at the end of Mr. Ramakrishnan's speech. And the instructions for it will come up on screen. I will explain them to you at that point. You will have 3 minutes for the voting. Mr. Ramakrishnan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mahesh. I think he has set exactly the context that I wanted him to set. And it's helped my cause. For close to 2.5 decades now, as a banker, I have always been called upon in the routine of my daily life to represent the cause of an entrepreneur in front of an investor. And in each of these instances, and there would have been thousands of such instances over these 25 years, there has always been the same pushback. So your position on valuation depends on where you sit. As Jairam Ramesh famously said, my position on a subject in the parliament depends on whether I sit in the treasury or in the opposition. So for the same investor who is looking at an asset, the valuation can be too expensive, and when he has invested in the company and he is looking to exit, the valuation becomes too cheap. So valuation, like beauty, my dear friends, lies in the eyes of the beholder. And because you're not able to comprehend it, you cannot brush it off as being arbitrary. So obviously there is some element of science, there is some element of art, there is some element of objectivity, there is some element of subjectivity, and the sum total of that is an end product where a deal happens. So there's a girl who meets a boy, and the boy thinks the girl is beautiful. He goes to his father and says, look, I'm in love with this girl and I want to marry her. In the eyes of the boy and in the eyes of the girl, there is science, there is logic. But as would be the case, in the eyes of the father and in the eyes of the mother, it is arbitrary. Same is the case with valuation. In the eyes of the buyer and in the eyes of the seller, there is a science, there is a logic, there is an intuitive underpinning of why it is happening. And in the eyes of the others, it could be an investor who has lost the case, or it could be an entrepreneur who is aspiring to build a similar business but is not getting the same value. He says that, look, it is arbitrary. So what is the science? So valuation, in my view, is very, very contextual. It is extremely circumstantial, and it is specific to a given situation. And it is a triangulation of, in my view, about 3 factors. Some factors which are very fundamental, some factors which are very technical, and some factors which are very structural. So what are these fundamental factors? Obviously, the more mundane things, which matters. As Albert Einstein once famously said, all that counts cannot be counted, and all that can be counted does not count. So fundamental things like revenue, profitability, growth, return, leadership position, uniqueness of the business, the passion, the drive, and the capability of the entrepreneur, all as perceived by the person on the other side. Very, very fundamental factors. You can put it down on a piece of paper and you can rationalize it. Some technical factors. I have been in the middle of deals where overnight I have pushed up the price by about 30%, simply because of demand and supply. So there is an element of irrationality to it, but you cannot brush it all off as irrational. So there is a dope of irrationality. So as long as the dope of irrationality is limited to that being just a dope, then it is fine. But if you get completely doped on it, then you have a problem. So there is demand and supply. There is exit, the grand greater fool theory. So will I be able to sell it off to another fellow 4 years down the line at a better value? There is logic. There is some intuitive logic even in that, as to whether I'll be able to find a buyer for this asset at a better value and whether I'll be able to get it. Third is structural, which always remains privy between the seller and the buyer. Are there mechanisms built into a deal structure which will enable somebody to recoup stake, which will enable somebody to readjust valuation, which will enable somebody to pass on gains or losses? So the point that I'm trying to say is that it's not all arbitrary. There is an element of science there. The element of science is often not fully explained. And because of the information asymmetry between the parties to the deal and the rest of the world, people tend to come to conclusions that what has happened is arbitrary. Obviously, an investor is not paid 2 and 20 to do an arbitrary deal. He's being paid 2 and 20 to take an educated call. And these are not people who are, passers-by on the roadside. So these are people who are educated. So there is obviously a deep-rooted science. The science sometimes doesn't become apparent. And because the science is not apparent, it often gets brushed aside as arbitrary. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, this is where we stand, 63% for and 37 against the motion.